Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy.
This is another episode with my wise sage colleagues, Rick Eigenbrod and Judy Brown. And we're talking about why leaders need to be centered. And in this conversation, we're going to get to things like the need for a comfort with ambiguity, being comfortable with not having the right answer and being comfortable with being curious, possibilities rather than history, being serious, not necessarily certain, and how to operate like a weeble. You'll hear more. Enjoy.
Well, welcome to this episode, and it's another episode. I'm joined by Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod from different parts of the world, and I'm actually in a different part of the world too this week, so a little bit darker and secluded in my hotel room. This week we want to talk about being centered as a leader and the importance of being centered, and part of the reason for this is because I'm seeing a lot of it in my work where life is overwhelming. People are being challenged to do more with less. It's getting more complicated. Then add to that things like AI and what we do and return to office policies and all that kind of thing. The leader tends to be the person in the middle of it. And a lot of my coaching has turned into an oasis of calm in a desert of craziness, and just want that moment to stop and think about what's happening and get centered again. And so I thought, where better to bring this idea to than my two wise sages, and see what thoughts they have about what leaders need to be doing to maintain their center. Judy, you're going to kick us off?
Yeah, I think who first comes to mind for me on this, and I probably mentioned him before, is Václav Havel, who was a jailed dissident poet in his country. And after he was freed, actually ended up participating in what was called the Velvet Revolution. It could have been bloody, but it was velvet, and ended up as president of his country. And he was, as you just described, beset by the challenges and the impossible situations and tremendous uncertainty. I think there's something about the relationship with uncertainty in all of this, and the major center of the changes that were going on was the city of Prague, and he just had all he could handle. So he left and went out into the country to stay with a friend, and just to try to catch his breath and get his feet on the ground, because he was finding the experience so pummeling, would be my term. But the guys in Prague wanted him back. And his attitude as a leader is one that I've often felt, wait a second, they know what they're doing. Why do they need me back? I need time out. But he went back to Prague because he said he realized what they found in him. He said there was nothing I could do as a leader they couldn't do for themselves. But what they found in him, and he was surprised by this, was that he was a non-anxious presence. And I think that phrase is an interesting way of describing a leader who's centered. He was a non-anxious presence. And because of that, the people around him could act without being confused. Such an interesting idea that it was being a non-anxious presence. Even when everything was crazy in his own world, he could somehow return to that enough so that the people around him who were looking to him for leadership, direction, modeling, felt that they could take action without being confused.
Yeah, as you were talking there, I wrote down that first thing you said about relationship with uncertainty, and that's a lot of what we're talking about. But then I've kind of flipped that and put that means it's a comfort with ambiguity.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. It's somehow being able to be at home with ambiguity, somehow finding a centered sort of place, even in the face of uncertainty, ambiguity. I think that's right. And I found myself too, I was taking some notes down because I was thinking about the ambiguity or uncertainty. And for me, those things can throw me. But I try to pay attention to where my mind goes in the face of that. And I find there are two paths. And so there's something in this about thinking about what your default is, where your mind wants to go. One path is fear, but the other path is curiosity. So one path is digging in and being afraid. The other is, David, to use your kind of educational background to make it adventure. And to notice what it is that allows you to go in the direction of curiosity and adventure.
Which, it's interesting you came, because I wrote possibilities rather than history, which your curiosity rather than fear kind of mirrors that, doesn't it? That the leader that is calm is future focused about the curiosity and the possibilities, rather one who gets anxious is often driven by the past, I would imagine.
I think that's right. The other thing is that there's something in this about being able to be authentically where you are. And that is, there will be times as a leader where I think we find ourselves saying to people, this is a lot. This is just a lot piling on all of us. But to help return oneself and invite others to return to what really matters, what matters most, what's our compass here, what are our own gifts and capacities that mean we're likely to find our way through this in a reasonable fashion, still standing and still alive at the end. I think those kinds of conversations with people are helpful. And I think that's where appreciative inquiry with its focus on what's life-giving, what's strength is helpful. So anyway, those are our initial thoughts about such matters of being centered. The Brits used to say to me, I had a British brother-in-law, and he used to say to me, this is before I had a British husband, I should add. And he would say to me, you're so grounded. I never could understand what that meant. I thought it was the weirdest language, but it's an interesting term for just feeling somehow that someone is solid and rooted in some way. That when Rick and I were talking about this, I was thinking about those playful things that wobble but don't fall over. I think that weebles, is that what they're called? Silly things, you hit them and they flop over and they bounce right back. And I remember a person I used to work with would say, weebles wobble, but they don't fall over. And I think there's something about letting people know that we're not immune from the wobble, but they can count on us to not fall over. So anyway, those are initial murmurations, musings about this. Rick, you want to wade in, because I know you have a lot to say on this. So what's up?
Just before Rick steps in there, because I just want to, that weeble idea, I think the heavier the base of a weeble, the less dramatic the swing. So, a weeble that wobbles quite a lot is going to cause chaos. A weeble that doesn't wobble too much is going to be much more level-headed, kind of less erratic, and that requires a heavier base.
Yes, and then the question becomes, for leaders, for you and for me, what is that heavier base that allows us to still be human, but not distracting people by a wild wobbling? So anyway,
Rick, what do you know about weebles?
Just what you guys have said. I was thinking as Judy spoke about the Brits, keep calm, carry on.
Yeah.
As we thought about this topic, the first thing I realized is this is a question that time immemorial. How does one stay centered? Where is that still point? How does one find it? What are the practices that allow one to find that place inside? The given that place inside is really very important to be able to access, to be able to get to, and a kind of the sense of it's a given that that is a really important place to go, and it's very important that we know how to get there. So that's what crossed my mind. So instead of thinking about those things, which so much has been written about, I just started thinking about my own experience in watching leaders, asking questions of myself that I probably haven't thought about in a bit. Also finding myself referencing some of the conversations we've already had. Everything everything you guys have already said is a part of that language we seek to be able to describe and find that place, right? I found myself saying it's a physical sensation. That to be centered is, how do you know you're there? It's a physical sensation, and each of us has experience of that physical sensation. So that if I asked each of you, tell me about a time in the swirl that you felt centered, you could say, oh God, there was this time. And that means each of us really do have, particularly as we've had more and more experience and more sailing through the storm, to use David's favorite metaphors of sailing, we know how to find that place inside of us. And I think that this notion about, yeah, I know what that place is, not so much conceptually, but physically. And I can maybe even go back and learn some things about how I got there. So that was one thing that struck me. The other thing that struck me was a reference to something we've said earlier, which is, what's the high value contribution of a leader? And all of a sudden it struck me, the ability to do this. High value contribution, as we've defined it in the past, is what is it that you and only you can do? And what is that you and only you can do that has enormous impact? Enormous impact is to be able to find that place. I call it of steely stillness. So it's that still point that allows you to be steely towards the external world and to feel steely when everything around you swirls. That personal platform. And you and only you can do that and model that and expect that.
So there's those times when a person feels centered and feels that spot and has that stability. I wonder whether these days leaders rarely find that in the moments of challenge, and yet they have to portray it, because that there's all these things going on around them, and they're probably as bent out of shape about some of them as the people around them, and yet what the people around them need from them is some sense of calm.
I think it's an interesting conundrum, David, in the sense that something artificial about being totally calm when things appropriately would make us rattled.
Yeah.
So that in the midst of something that is quite threatening or quite uncertain or quite ever, if you seem too calm, people are going to go, what is she taking? I think it's the ability to, in a sense, have them understand you're feeling what they're feeling. It is appropriate to feel this, but there is a place I have in the midst of this that I can go. And so we're not trying to inoculate ourselves or anesthetize ourselves, but we are trying to find a place that says, in the midst of this, I have a resource that is absolutely fundamentally essential. And it's the ability to know where that place is in me to get there. And it's not to be confused with, I have the right answers, I know what to do, and I have certainty. Not to be confused with those things.
Which goes back to that being comfortable with ambiguity as well, isn't it? But then also being sufficiently comfortable, and I can drive people in a direction to lessen that ambiguity.
Yeah, and I think that one of the notes I made to myself is when you can find that place, it allows you, and this is a concept I think about every now and then, and I'll watch in leaders. It allows you to be serious. And one of the things that people look for in leaders is when they make pronouncements, are they serious? Not certain, but serious. Right? I'm not certain this is what we're going to do or should do, but this is what we're going to do. And so one of the things I think leaders can ask themselves is, when do I know I'm serious? And more importantly, what do they see that tells them I'm serious? So when they leave the meeting and go talk to each other, you think he was serious about that? They will make a determination. They know sometimes, and this is the scary part, they know sometimes better than we do when we are serious. And Judy, you're shaking your head because we've experienced that with the leaders we work with. Yeah. We watch them, we go, oh my God, they're not serious. And everybody knows it. And they expect them to run out of the room and, die on the hill. No, and it's not going to happen.
I was going to say, sometimes they know before we know, which is the thing that's unsettling about this.
Exactly.
That we radiate this more than we know. When you ask a ways back about, a time when we remembered.
Yes.
What was odd for me, what came to mind was not a work situation, but then, so follow me, it connected to somebody I've seen who's a very gifted leader in work situations. And that person is Peter Senge. But I want to start back one story, which is I found myself years back, unexpected reasons, in Vail, Colorado, with the political leaders of a particular administration who had gone there to ski. And I found myself skiing in a snowstorm, absolutely solo, in gorgeous, gorgeous conditions. But you couldn't see very far because the snow was so thick. When you asked that question, I could feel all of that immediately. The solidness of it, the skill that I had as a skier, which was pretty reasonable, the ability to read the slope, just almost all of it. And what came to mind is one of the best leaders I've worked with, Peter Senge at MIT, is also a gifted skier. And so I'm back to the somatic thing that you mentioned, Rick, and that is, I think perhaps for many leaders, the ability to bring to mind circumstances physically where they find themselves in that place is part of being able to return to that place at will in difficult situations that seem unlike. I mean, for me yesterday, my very best friend on the earth had open heart surgery at Johns Hopkins. She came through it fabulously well. But yesterday for me, both in terms of wanting to be sending constructive energy in her direction, and also just because this was a big deal, I realized that I was in the place of movement and that kind of skiing sense of things. I hadn't thought about it before, but these things all fit together. It is somatic, and being able to bring one or another circumstance to mind, one day I was working with Sengi on something or other. I can't remember what it was. He was he would admit to this, I think, so I'm just going to say it publicly, completely distracted, disoriented. He was abuzz with things, and he was down on his hands and knees working on flip charts to get his thoughts together. And it was not getting better. He was getting more and more sort of buzzed about the whole thing. And I thought, what can I do to help? And so I said to him, Peter, it's just moguls. Moguls are the hills on a ski slope that you have to simply ride one way or another, and you can't even see them coming at you sometimes. You just have to have your knees bent. Peter, it's just moguls. The show that we're about to do is just moguls. And he looked at me really startled, and he completely calmed down and went to work.
Judy,
so has that got to do with the fact that I mean, what you're describing there is the connection with the skiing is that they've experienced that place where they were probably in over their skis, I think, or whatever the term is.
Yes,
and survived.
Out over your skis. Over your skis and survived.
Yeah, and they survived. And because I don't ski, but I was thinking to whitewater kayaking, that same spot, that, wow, that was wild, and I got through it. And it was that fact that I got through it because everything was just, it just slotted into place. The muscle memory was there. Everything was like your bouncing knees. It just became that, I know how to ride this out.
Yes.
If you picture a kayaker and you picture someone with moguls or a skier, everything moves but this. I'm pointing to this. Everything moves but that.
I'll say the heart just for the listeners.
Just for the heart, that's placed right in the center. And Judy, it's funny, you and I, we've been hanging out together too long. We start thinking all the same thoughts. I was thinking, what an exercise for leaders to periodically do is to go away somewhere, first by yourself, and bring back to mind, bring back to body those experiences, those incidents where you had access to that. God knows how you got it, but you did. And it's not so much that you want a formula for getting there, you want a reference point to move towards, and and re-put that place back in your body. And then go ask people, when did you see me in that place of stillness? Mm-hmm. When things swirled, and they may have memories of you in that state that you aren't even aware of.
See, we're talking skiing and kayaking, and I wonder if, as I look back over the last 25, 30 years, that there's some people that we know in manufacturing who've had that same experience in a manufacturing world because they've been in turnarounds and situations like that. And so as they get elevated, they bring the calm because they know, hey, this is just a problem to be solved and we'll get through it.
I think that's a wonderful example. There's that kind of sense of a friend of mine would say the rhythm of manufacturing. They have a sense of that internally, so that in even uncertain situations in manufacturing, they can make very fast sense of it. Wow.
And I think it allows you to do what leaders need to do sometimes. Set boundary conditions, set expectations, set requirements, set goals, if you will, draw a line in the sand, whatever it is. And then to have people know when you do that, you are serious. So that leads immediately into action, coordinate, all the things you would want to have happen. But it all begins with you knowing what you want and them and insisting on it out of this place, and them knowing that. Everything comes after that. And one of the things I look for is, and this is a sort of oversimplification. I like David's got red and green visuals on this, but for me, the language is, what I see is big self, small ego, a big sense of self, a well-developed sense of oneself. In that, this is who I am. This is where I go, as opposed to operating out of ego. And your story about Havel, that's so egoless. He shows up with a big self.
That's also Jim Collins' level 5 leadership.
It's another way of thinking of it.
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's an interesting combination though, isn't it? Because in some ways it's that calm hand on the helm. But in other ways, as you're saying, Rick, it's that person that's able to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And even if this is what we're going to do is let's get in this conference room, start on these whiteboards and work out what the right thing to do is, that at least somebody's bringing action out of what feels like chaos.
You know, a minute ago, this question that you asked about who could tell you what you look like when you're in that place, in the midst of the swirl. And what came back for me, actually, I'm sitting here on a very plain couch in my living room. And what it brought back was a time when I was in the midst of a high stakes interview process for a fellowship. And the guy asking me the questions was the most powerful, mean-spoken, antagonistic person that I've ever sat through interviewing with. And he was pacing up and down in front of me like this and peppering me with questions, some of which I could answer and some of which I simply had to say, you know, I don't have any experience with that, so I really don't have a point of view on it. This went on for about 20 minutes. And my mentor at that time, John Gardner, when the 20 minutes was over, stopped this guy. He was a CEO. He stopped and he said, Mike, you never laid a glove on her. And, and when you ask that question, who would see it when you don't necessarily see it in yourself, or who could tell you what it looks like? That's what came flying back 45 years ago, that one moment.
That's a great example, Judy. Every leader has to answer this question for themselves. And we've spoken about this. Why would they follow me? Followership is, as we've spoken in the past, it's not compliance, right? Followership is not compliance. Followership is a relationship between a leader and a follower. And every leader, I think, in order to have that sense, has to have come to some terms with themselves about the answer to the question, why would they follow me? And if you don't have an answer to that, they certainly won't. So what is that you and only you can do? One, have an answer to that question. Why would they follow me? And the second thing that came to mind is this ability, this capacity, if you will, we're talking about to find that place. How do you institutionalize that?
And that was kind of where the question I was going to ask, because I wonder back to Judy, your interview situation. And so somebody else notices that he's never laid a glove on. What were you doing in amongst this high stakes, high risk interview? What was allowing you to come off that way?
That's such a great question. I think I had no safe place to be but to tell the truth. That was the first thing. And I what comes to mind is I was unmovable. He was the guy peppering me with the questions, the CEO of whatever big oil company that he was at that point, was dashing up and down in front of me, and I wasn't moving. So, I mean, that's physical.
So why? What caused you to, what your heart said the right thing to do right now is to not move?
I don't know. That is I think it was related to being really clear about my own truth. about what I brought to that situation and what I didn't bring, what I could answer honestly to questions, and where I didn't have an answer, and I was perfectly comfortable not having the answer. And the other thing is, Rick often says you have to know which ditch you're willing to die in, and I always have trouble with that language. But I think in this case, my life wasn't at stake, just a high prestige fellowship was. And somehow I was clear about that. That's all I can say. It's wild to think about this. This is really fun for me. I wasn't promised that fellowship. I actually ended up being very surprised when I ended up having it. And maybe that was part of it. Maybe it's the curiosity and the willingness to be surprised both by the questions and this erratic behavior of this man. I hadn't seen many people behave like that. So it made me really curious about what's the deal here. But I was clear that my life was not at stake.
Judy, I think that, that phrase I got from a colleague, and it is so powerful to me. And I've talked to leaders and about these moments when, everything's swirled and they didn't know what to do. And I tell them that story. And they said, I wish I'd have known then that story, because this is what I would have done. And ironically, had I done that, I think all the things I feared would happen wouldn't have happened. And I think that if I'm going to try some words here, so I can hear what I think, as usual, I think it has to do with the ability to have a sense about what matters more than what.
Whoa.
And what outcome you will choose, what outcome you can live with, what is it that you are, call it a non-negotiable or something like that, that you choose this on the basis of, this is the most important thing. It is a non-negotiable. And if I'm going to go down, I'll go down around this.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly your sense about and perspective about, hey, it's not my life, it's just a fellowship, is hugely helpful. But I remember the same friend who would use the concept about the ditch to die in, having a conversation with a leader, and I might have mentioned this in the past, about how do you live with all the stress? How do you live with the risk? How do you live with the consequences of your decisions? And there's, and the guy said, let me give you an example. And he gave me an example about a thing he faced. And he said, and if I did this, it would have real consequence. It was the right thing to do. But if I did it, it would have real consequence. And then he said, and that's why they call it integrity. And that feeling, you can almost feel that in your body when you tell the story. And that, yes, it would have consequence. And that's why they call it integrity. And what you feel in the body is that same place.
Which is that it must be the same way people feel about how many
Sorry.
times.
Could be trick-or-treaters already. Who knows? Forgive me.
So I say it could be what it's like to be a general and make a decision and say, I know this decision has consequences and I still think it's the right thing. And I know there's some people going to die as a result of it, but it's still, I have to live with that at the end of the day, which is that sense of what's important as well. Because, as you were saying there, Judy, about clarity as to what matters more than what. And I remember back when my daughter rode off my wife's car that she'd had for a week and called us to say that she had just smashed it. And the first thing both of us said was, what?
Are you okay?
Are you okay? Yeah. Because that's the piece that says the piece of metal is replaceable. But that's that clarity as to what matters more than what at the heart of that. And I think that kind of message, when leaders in organizations are faced with all of this turmoil, it's the ones that are able to quickly work out what's the most important thing and say, "Are you okay?" To the equivalent of that. That's that, because that, you know what my daughter was thinking, I'm going to get so much crap for this. But when the first question back is, "Are you okay?" Then okay, then are you in a safe place? And all of that kind of stuff. And it was nothing to do with the car.
And she will remember that moment for the rest of her life.
That's right.
Maybe not.
I would think, but just what I think.
So, I mean, it's interesting that I was just looking at what we've been talking about there. It's a comfort with ambiguity. It's a comfort with not having the answer. And so it's being serious as well as that. So even though we're not certain, it's being curious. It's having clarity as to what matters the most. It's looking at possibilities or curiosity rather than fear. And that idea of what we can do is set the expectation, some boundary conditions, provide clarity, engage in the right way. And it might be as simple as to say, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I love your notion, David, of the humanity in, look, we're going to lose that place. Mm-hmm. We're going to lose that place. We don't want to expect our leaders to never lose the place. We want to be there when they do, one. Secondly, every time we lose it, we have to go refine it. Mm-hmm. It's the Carnegie Hall effect, right? How do you get the Carnegie Hall? Remember the old thing? Practice, practice, practice. Every time I lose it, I have to go back and deepen my learning, not relearn, deepen my learning about where it is and how I get there.
Yeah, and just for listeners, we were talking in the build-up about Humanergy's red path and green path principles, which is in our book, What Great Teams Do Great. If you want to pick up a copy and read it, you'll find all about it. Highly recommended. But the this idea of mentally we can go down the red path, which is attack, avoid, blame, excuses, whining, things. And we all have that inside us. It's the fight, flight, freeze. It's all of that stuff. But then emotional intelligence is the thing that unhooks us from that and gets us back on the green path, which is about being caring, honest, and direct, listening, and focusing on a forward solution, if you like. That so that comes back to what we've been talking about. The more we practice that emotional intelligence, the more we understand that, the more we recognize, and I found this a few years ago that I know I always joke that I teach this stuff and my wife taught mindfulness and meditation for 15 years and we still have fights. Yeah, absolutely. They're funny ones, but it used to be we fought quite a lot on a Friday night, and that would kill our weekends because we wouldn't talk to each other for the weekend. It'd be like, what a waste of a weekend. And then we started digging in and saying, well, why? And we both had busy weeks, probably traveling, all this stuff, and we get home Friday night and somebody would say something and we wouldn't be on our best version of ourselves, and we'd pull at that thread, and that would take us, because we didn't clock what was happening. And the moment we recognize that, we start to say, on a Friday night now, we can say, this probably isn't a Friday night conversation, and we can move on. And so we can still enjoy our weekend because we know that that's likely to take us down that path because our shields are down, if you like, for a Star Trek metaphor.
Well, and so part of this is knowing how to return to this steely stillness. While we were talking about this, heron went by at eye level while we were talking. I thought that steely stillness. It's knowing how to return to it, but there's something in this, David, that your story underlines, which is to know when we're most at risk for, I'm going to say, losing it. I want to add unnecessarily or gracelessly, or and yet at the same time, I want to return to what Rick said, which is this is not about masking the difficulty or pretending that I'm fine when I'm not fine. But it's about the inner knowledge that allows us to get back faster to the centered place, and maybe to lose it less often because we become more alert to the conditions where we're particularly vulnerable to it. The Friday nights, what we used to say, Meg used to come home from camp at 5:00, and she'd come into the house. And this is little summer camp. She'd walked home down to the house. She'd come in and she would fall apart. No matter what we did, there would be this huge explosion. And we used to call it the 5 o'clocks. And I think grownups have variants of those. And finally, one day she explained to us, she said, all day long, I've been being nice to people. I've been being polite. She listed all the things she'd been being. She was out of all those things by the time she got home at 5 o'clock, and we got the rest of it. But to allow ourselves the grace to know that that's true also of us, and to do what we can to stay out of conditions, or on the other side, do its best as we can to stay in conditions where we're likely to be able to stay solidly centered, no matter what.
So tune in, reflect, give yourself some grace, and practice being a weeble.
Yes.
And that's another 40-some minutes you've spent listening to Judy, Rick, and I pontificate on leadership. So I appreciate the time once again, and I look forward to the next chat we have.
Amen. Thank you, Dave.
Judy.
So that was a conversation with Judy and Rick once again, just to hit some of the high points. That a strong relationship with uncertainty is critical. The idea of being clear as to what matters more than what else, what matters most. That surround yourself with people who can help you recognize and get back to being centered, and be serious, not certain, possibilities rather than history, comfort with ambiguity, comfort with curiosity, and then making sure that you're the calm hand on the helm.
That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.